Hey there, welcome to Christ for Life. The title of the message today is, Are You My Neighbor? And I want to look at Luke 10, starting in verse 25. We're going to go 25 through 37 of the 10th chapter of Luke. And of course, it's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it struck me as I was listening to an audio rendition of this chapter, the 10th chapter of Luke. The person who was recording it, they accentuated the question of the expert in the law, that is, are you my neighbor? And the way they accentuated it, it pierced my consciousness. And I thought, what a whiny individual, this expert in the law, to ask a question like that, who is my neighbor? And it just stuck in my mind. So as I'm listening to the rest of the parable, and it would get to Jesus' summing up the parable and then, of course, asking a question to bring it to a close, it dawned on me that Jesus never answered the question. He never answered the question, who is that person's neighbor? The question that he asked, well, let's pay attention to Luke 10 and we'll get to that. But he did not ask the question or answer the question, who is the neighbor of the expert in the law? Because Jesus asked another question. So let's get into it. This is chapter 10 of Luke. Then an expert in the law stood up to test him, saying, Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? This is verse 25. Now, verse 26 and following. What is written in the law? He asked him. How do you read it? He answered. This is, of course, the expert in law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then verse 28, Jesus answered by this. He said, You've answered correctly, he told him. Do this and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, And who is my neighbor? So pay attention. The question is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus took up the question and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. And then you know the rest of the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you can read that if you want on your own. But in the interest of time, I won't read the rest of the verses. But then, toward the end, as Jesus goes through this parable, in verse 36, he says, Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And as I was listening to kind of this dramatized rendition of Luke 10, and I hear then Jesus' question, who proved to be a neighbor? And watch what happens. Verse 37, the one who showed mercy to him, he said, that is the expert in law gives that answer. Then Jesus told him, go and do the same. So the expert in the law asked the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus doesn't answer that question. He asks another question. He turns the question around and he says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor? That's a little different than asking who is the neighbor. And so I wrote down a couple of thoughts I wanted to share with you with this in mind, but bear that kind of in your thought process, that the question is who's my neighbor, but Jesus says, no, who proved to be a neighbor? Slightly different question. You see, who is my neighbor is not a kingdom question. Jesus doesn't answer it. He asks a different question. Who proved to be a neighbor? It's like asking this question, and it's a subtle difference, and kind of put it in a way that you might understand it a different way. Imagine asking the question, who is my son? But that puts the focus on the traits of an identity of who is a son. Who is my son? Okay, so now you're putting the emphasis on the son. But if you frame it a little different and you ask a question, who is a son? All of a sudden, every man will have to answer that question. Every man alive is a son to somebody. Instead of saying, who is my son, it's who is a son. All of a sudden, the emphasis is put on every man must answer that question. Am I acting like a son? Take the focus on who's my son and those traits, but am I acting like a son? That's the kingdom question Jesus asked. Who proved to be a neighbor? not who is your neighbor. You see, Jesus turned the question around. He didn't start answering the question by listing off all the people who would qualify to be a neighbor. You see, that's what the expert in law wanted. Who is my neighbor? And so Jesus doesn't start listing off qualifications to be a neighbor. He wants us to ask if we're a neighbor. Biblical compassion, grace, and mercy have no boundaries. And therefore, the question, who is my neighbor, is a worldly question. The kingdom question is, are you a neighbor? That's the kingdom question. Who proved to be the neighbor? Beautiful, beautiful turning of the question by Jesus Christ from a worldly question to a kingdom question. Don't focus on the traits of your neighbors. Focus on, are you a neighbor? That's the kingdom question. God bless you all. We'll see you all soon.